All right, welcome everybody. My name is John Buck. I'm part of the Beverly community, a community for open collaboration discussion. Today I'm joined by four different people to be discussing Slavoj Žižek's God in Pain, a lecture that he presented, I guess sort of a talk. What I've done is cut out some portions from it, and we're sort of going to be going over each and then sort of discussing it. I tried to get a nice hodgepodge of different perspectives to go over it with me. So as you might see, we have Nick, who's looking particularly shiny today, but he's a regular to the channel, I'm sure you all recall. We also have Layman, who's here as well. He's a philosophical theist that on Twitter, I have all the links down below. He's quite the fan of Hegel and of Zizek and of Nietzsche, so he'll be a wonderful insight for this conversation. Go ahead, say something too.
Pretty much everything that John just said. I would consider my religious views to somewhat revolve around philosophical theism, and what that means from what I can tell, because I find my religious views kind of hard to box, but that seems to be just the most accurate label. So it's probably better that I just describe what that means. I don't follow a particular religion, but I do believe in God and what God is, like what God descriptively is, what I believe to be like sort of universally amongst all religions. I believe that that's real, and I sort of that sort of provides me with axiomatic motivation for like moral action and stuff like that. Yeah. I'm also an anarcho-centrist, which is a half joke of a label. Yeah. Yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that.
Okay. We also have Christian as well, who's inspiring Christianity on Twitter. He's deeply interested in the intellectual sort of intellectual backings and background and support for Christianity, and along with the resurrection and all of its philosophical arguments for and against Christianity. I don't know. Go ahead, say something, Christian. Are you there?
Wait, give me 1 second, please.
Oh, there you are. Okay, yeah. But okay, so that's Christian. We also have Pragmatic Culture, or Prag, as well. He's quite the fan of Hegel and also of Zizek as well. He's considered, I don't know, he's probably one of the most based Catholics I know of on Twitter. So he'll be an interesting sort of another voice to bring up here. Okay. Yeah, Christian just had to step out for a second, but he'll be back. Go ahead, say something, Prag.
And stream ish ideology. And so, yeah, no. Hello. I like Zizek.
That's good.
Yeah, this will be good.
Awesome.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, yeah. And that's the thing. Like, I listened to this lecture probably about maybe like 4 months back or something like that, and I commented to the other guys like, there's so much to this that is just sort of foreign and unique, especially to Zizek, because like Zizek's kind of presenting this whole new outlook on Christianity from this very atheistic sort of lens, but he's doing so in a very strange way. It's almost like theologically based, and like he has sort of a theological support for his atheism, which is kind of surprising, but it's interesting. All right, so we'll just go into that. We've got like about 2-minute clips that I'll just let play through, and then afterwards we can kind of discuss each of them, and they'll sort of be building off of each other, but it's from the lecture God in Pain, or the talk God in Pain. So I will go ahead and share a screen. Yes, share. And I need to make sure that it's sharing audio as well. Actually, tell me if you guys can hear this. Can you hear that?
I cannot hear that, no.
Cannot. Okay.
No, I cannot.
In sharing screen. Okay, yeah, I got to do share computer sound. There we go. All right. All right. Go ahead and start.
This was a great topic of debates. Not only this, but even the most elementary questions. Like whenever I'm in debate, sometimes Europe,
I heard that.
especially Catholic bishops and so on, I noticed
You
how
guys
often
can hear this, right?
Pardon me?
Can you guys hear the video playing?
I can.
Oh,
Yeah.
I paused it right now. Okay, good. Just making sure.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you're good.
it's easy to embarrass them by asking the most elementary questions. Like once I asked them, why did God have to die on the cross? And they looked at me as if I'm asking a prohibited questions. And it's true because, you know, like the moment you go into this exchange of commodities topic, like to pay the price for our sins, you are lost. It doesn't work. First, to pay the price for our sins to whom? You must know this better than me. The only consequent answer would be that there should be another guy, like the devil. And this was, I think, one of the early heresies, no?
Yes.
That God says to the devil, I love humanity so much that I give you my son.
The ransom is paid to Satan.
Yeah. Then some people claim it is so that it is because justice must be done. We are in paganism here, which means as if there is even above God. This is typical, I think, pre-Christian idea that God is not really the top. There is some kind of a cosmic destiny, justice to which even God has to be subordinated. Then the worst answer for me is because if God were just to pardon us without this spectacle of death on the cross, then we wouldn't be grateful to God. But wait a minute, God becomes here a disgusting narcissist who really wants to be loved, and you know, it's like PR of God. Let's do a nice spectacle so that, and the most obscene answer here for me is that of Nicolas Malebranche, who says that God created humanity. He goes even further from this mirror image. He says God wanted to be admired. He even goes as far as to say that without Jesus Christ's sacrifice, we wouldn't all be lost, but we would all be redeemed automatically. Malebranche says directly, God threw us all into sin so that he could save some of us, to show gratitude. So we have here clearly what we call a perverse God. So you know what I mean? What I mean by this, I'm not just, I hope, losing our precious time. What I want to say is this is not an argument against Christianity, but quite of the contrary. It makes my point, which I think at least at some level consonates, if I may also use like you this terminology from our youth hippie era. We have a positive vibrations here with what you said, that there is something that is a little bit impenetrable even today. Something tremendous happens in the very focus of Christian experience, which is then covered up with the usual dogma and so on and so on.
Let's see, stop share. There we go. All right, so that's the first clip. Him sort of like taking the piss out of quite a few Catholic priests by just asking them sort of probably the most significant question you could have in Christianity, like, why did God have to die on the cross? And then kind of pointing out how the various answers that are tried to be attempted to be given for such a serious question all don't really work, at least from kind of the way that you can try to typically think about it. Like he says that like the whole idea of cosmic justice is very much tied to sort of this paganistic sort of cosmic order to the universe that stands even outside of God, that God has to like do certain things in order to come in to do justice properly. And surprisingly enough, at the end there, he's doing this not as an argument against Christianity, so he says, but rather as, I guess, a point being made that this is something so significant and yet something so mysterious. And then from that, Christianity sort of has to build up these dogmas off of this sort of prime mystery, I guess you could say. And then from there, you kind of get the more structured understanding of religion. But yeah, you guys go ahead and sort of share your thoughts on that, and then we can kind of move on as we go.
I thought Žižek was right, at least in his critiques, like that these views make God essentially some kind of narcissist and perverse, I think, in the very his sense of the word, whereas perverse is someone who seeks, absolute authority and seeks to wield it. It's kind of a shallow definition of perverse, I think, but it's still keeping in kind of line with his sort of thoughts of things. And while you're right, while he's right, I should say, that you can build sort of a dogmatic religion off of this prime mystery, I think he's also right in saying that for not only for a lot of people, but really for a deeper theology, it would be hard to build something off of this. And so while he can use it to make his point, and we'll hear the rest of the clip in a second, I don't think it would. I think if you talked with more educated people, I don't know who he's getting these answers from. I don't know the other guy he was quoting. I looked him up, but it seems like the people he's getting these answers from might not have. I don't know.
I'm sure there's probably also a bit of Žižekian humorous spin put onto the answers as well, as you kind of see later. Like,
yeah, that's probably true as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Layman.
Yeah, I would say something that really just stood out to me was the whole God is not really at the top. There's a cosmic destiny of which God is subordinated to. But what I find a little maybe confusing, I don't know what the right word is, what I find a little odd, I guess, about that is it's Jesus that's being crucified. And that's what Žižek's referring to. He's referring to the crucifixion. Now, I know that, Jesus, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, he's all these things simultaneously or whatever. And for me, it's sort of to just include the highest possible order in that. I'm not necessarily sure if that's correct, because what I think God is that it's sort of the, it's the omnipotent, perfect, what have you, ideal. And that is definitionally, quote unquote, the top. Now, I think when Jesus is embodying that, especially, with the crucifixion and what its meaning is, what it symbolizes, yada, yada, yada. I think that that's sort of I guess you could say, mediation between, Jesus as a self versus God, the ideal, way of acting, the ideal that is continuously judging him and his actions, what have you, and is sort of encouraging him to engage in that, moral action, dying for your sins or what have you. So I don't know if I agree with that. God is not really the top. And then using an example in which God only plays one role, in which there's sort of also Jesus, also, the Son is also incorporated in that. I just find that a little strange. And maybe that's just because, I'm not as well versed in Christianity as you guys are. So maybe there's just something I'm missing there. But that's my very messy take on that, I guess.
I might go the route of diving more directly into the perverse God claim, and say that it, to my mind, it makes more sense to characterize God as fundamentally desirous above all else. Mm-hmm. And I have largely built my own personal kind of understanding of Christianity off of that touchstone. Many of the other qualities, not necessarily of classical theism, but strong qualities within the Christian tradition. For example, right, if you have God is fundamentally desirous, then the mode of action of that desire we describe as love. But that's very different than describing God as fundamentally love, right? There's a modal switch there.
There's in our conversation on Peterson's maps of meaning, Nicholas, you kind of brought up how there's a distinction between acting due to some sort of deprivation in yourself towards like some sort of end goal that you're working towards, versus the acting as an expression of outward expression of overflowing.
You brought up an idea that I wanted to touch on and forgot, so thank you. But it was that hidden in the assumption of Žižek's account is that Christ's crucifixion is fundamentally a bad thing. And I think that's important, because he's building the rest of his account off of, whatever, a just God wouldn't require pain in order to satisfy his desire or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
So there's a fundamental judgment on Žižek's part that goes hidden, because it's assumed by most humans who experience pain that we want to not be in pain, right? And I think that when you're looking at the crucifixion story, there's something, again, the paradox that he seems to be trying to hone in on is the point where what appears to be the ultimate reduction of will becomes the ultimate expression of will, right? The ultimate expression of pain becomes the ultimate expression of love, right? So the paradox there, he's centering in on it, but he's doing so by highlighting whether it's his own or the commonly accepted frame with which to understand the situation, that I don't think actually makes sense for trying to apply some meaning to what the crucifixion is representing.
Yeah, I like that you brought up how he's sort of going against the common understanding of Christianity, because I think that's kind of how it is. Like, there's a weird sort of sense that the crucifixion of Jesus is like the greatest injustice to ever occur inside of reality, but at the same time, like the most important and significant event that ever happened within the universe, even to the point that it sort of like centralizes all of our time. Like, time came up to that point, in a way, at least for Jesus' life, not exactly the crucifixion, but that as being the culmination point of reality, as being that. And so there is sort of this weird, I guess, paradox within Christianity, where while this is something that the highest God willed to occur, or I said highest God, but an omnipotent, all good God willed to occur, like through a voluntary sacrifice, like Jesus willed to undergo crucifixion, while at the same time being something that is the greatest act of injustice to occur, a perfect, sinless man, and even God. The only thing that the only thing that is good is God. God himself being the victim of an injustice. And it's this, very weird sort of paradox that I don't think a lot of common Christians really have a way to sort of describe it in sort of this binary, oh, this was a good thing or this was a bad thing.
Well, and you can see why there's so many Gnostic strains within Christianity, because this event, as taken as the ultimate injustice, is the perfect realization of Gnosticism. And so it's mitigation, how it deals with that fact. And this, I think, will make more sense when we get into Christianity as the base of atheism, right? That's Gnostic Christianity. Gnostic Christianity should take you to atheism, right? That's its realization. So
at least
how
atheism,
it goes about mitigating that problem is like really central to the religion and what it's doing, right? How do you both accept Gnosticism as a legitimate realization and then mitigate its effect and recover creation through the realization of it, not by the rejection? Right.
Yeah, because that's a significant difference between Gnosticism and Christianity. Is Gnosticism rejects God, the creator of our world, being the all-good, omnipotent, all-loving God, because there's the demiurge, or Yahweh, that created this world, and he's kind of dumb, he's kind of stupid, maybe he means well, something like that, and he's the one sort of running the show for how the world operates. But the way the world works isn't best. Like, good people are going to face injustices. And so given that fact, what do you do? And so from Gnosticism, there's sort of the turn inwards to think about.
And sorry, I'm hogging up airtime. This is my last little point, because I find it really interesting for dealing with this, because the Gnostic drive is worldwide.
Yes.
But an interesting point is that within Hinduism, originally Brahma was the god that was most worshipped, right? He was viewed as the highest of the Trimurti, the three godheads. He is specifically assigned the role of creation. And you have a change in the religion with the reduction of the Brahmin culture, where Brahma is no longer allowed to be worshipped. And right, there's a bunch of stories that go along with this, with Brahma's fall as the creator, right? The usual story is he creates a woman who he's so obsessed with, he looks in every direction so that he can see her at all times, right? And he sprouts a head for each direction. And in her desperation, she tries to jump over him. He sprouts a fifth head out the top, and Shiva comes and chops the head off, right? And then Brahma, from each of his four remaining heads, is doomed to recite the Rig Veda forevermore, and he should never be worshipped by people, right? So there's this deep, something in us is like really rejecting the act of creation itself, right? So it's interesting how various religions try and deal with it.
Yeah, and it's so funny too, because like it seems like this is almost like a culmination, I guess, of Christianity in a sense. Like that's what Nietzsche brings up in his sort of critique of Christianity, is that it's a rejection of the body and of the earth, or not just the earth, but Christians becoming so infatuated with moralizing their existence come to sort of realize that the existence they exist within is not fitting towards our moralistic ideals that we have. And so from there, he sees Gnosticism as the appropriate culmination of Christianity. And he, of course, rejects Gnosticism because of its sort of like resentment.
Rejection of the eternal return.
Well, yeah, and like Nietzsche being sort of this fully pro-life philosopher. Anything that exists within life, he loves, and that's he'll say yes to. Go ahead, Layman, because I know
I was just waiting for a time to chime in. I don't know where to chime in.
No. I wanted to bring you in through Nietzsche as well.
I know. Okay. I don't really know how to respond to any of that, actually. I think that I don't have a response. I wasn't prepared to respond yet, so I know you saw me unmute and you were like, oh yeah, there he is, he's ready. But
I was setting up the hook with Nietzsche and then trying to see if you could comment on it. That's okay, we'll get into it further. Okay. Christian or Prag, do you want to say anything, or we can move on to the next clip?
I was just going to add the one thought, that being when Nietzsche says the death of Christ is necessarily kind of selfish, like it's a sort of act in order to make us feel grateful for what God has done for us. I would almost say, in the case of Žižek, selfish doesn't necessarily mean bad. I guess as we would think about it, yes, it would, in like, just in the common connotation of the word selfish. But I think in Žižek's case, and in the way he comes from it, he kind of comes from this sort of Lacanian school of psychoanalysis, where the whole point of it is to somewhat realize, the whole point of the psychoanalysis is to realize you don't need the psychoanalyst. He's just a huckster. You can kind of go out and fix yourself, sort of, to some extent. And so rather than the selfish act on God being bad, the question is more so, where does that leave us, humanity, in terms of, well, there's this God who just, he's making us try to glorify him, essentially. But if he's just in it for himself, what are we to do? And I think that kind of gets into somewhat of Zizek's view about how after the crucifixion, it doesn't go back to the Old Testament. It doesn't go back to, God intervening for our sake. He kind of leaves it to us and says, all right, well, I kind of did my thing. You're on your own a little bit. He doesn't quite take it in that direction exactly from the point of God is, selfish, but he does go to the point where, we are left on our own no matter what the circumstances after the crucifixion. That's kind of it. Nothing is the same after it.
I have a clip for that as well. Not this one, but the one after that we'll go into as well.
I do want to add something now that I can. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
I find it really strange when Žižek talks about God as like an omnipotent, like he describes God as though it's supposed to be like a human being like you and I. And so when he's applying these labels of like, oh, he wants, God just expects us all to worship him and put his image on a pedestal. And it's like, wow, what a self-entitled prick, you know? But like, I find it really weird because Žižek is a Hegelian, and Hegel did not view God that way. Hegel viewed God as, Hegel didn't believe that God was a being. So it's really weird to apply labels like, oh, God is a narcissist, God is applying these sort of like value judgments that you would apply onto other people. Because it feels like within Žižek's sort of, I guess, theoretical framework, he shouldn't necessarily view God as a like a living, breathing being and just sort of this immaterial thing of worship, I guess.
I see Žižek's sort of interpretation of Christianity and Judaism as well as fully based from the mythology within Christianity and within Judaism as well. Like we have a clip of the story of Job, and Job very much has sort of this personalistic, I guess, conception of God, where God's making bets with the devil over the life of Job, and like this is sort of the picture of God that it seems like Žižek is sort of working with and kind of considering Christianity from within.
Yeah,
I think I would again try and double down on the perverse God and go that the ultimate failure of narcissism is not narcissism itself, it's that narcissism does not ever actually realize its dream.
Yes.
Right. And I would argue that this is exactly what we are looking at as well when Christ confronts Satan in the desert. Right. In a very deep sense, that whole bit is just Christ almost saying, hey, I beat you to it, fucker. Right. And it's what's amazing about that whole bit, right, is that what is redeemed in that exchange is actually the desire of Satan, right? But Satan himself is rejected in the process. And in a real way, you almost get you almost get the image that Satan wanted to play the role of God, but did not want to be God, right? It's actually a lesser desire. It's a more miniature. It's shrunk, right? It's I want to put on the airs of God without having to be it, right? And the whole revelation of Christ is like the cost of the realization of the full desire, right? Where it's not held back, where it's not kept within some limited little distorted realm, right? And so again, applying this to like, is it appropriate to apply words like narcissism to a being like God? I think it is entirely appropriate so long as you blow out whatever your conception of narcissism is, because it takes on another worldly quality when you unrestrain your desire, your narcissistic desire, when you blow it out outside of the realms of human and what could possibly be contained within a human, right? Your ability to act in the world. Narcissism takes on, it reaches the paradox point where narcissism stops meaning the thing that we always classify it as, right? And that's, I think, the key to the whole thing, right? You're trying to process a paradox. And so long as you fall into the Gödelian error of trying to make sense of the paradox outside of the tools that are appropriate for digesting a paradox,
right,
you will necessarily err towards indulgence or anti-life, right? And you'll keep teeter-tottering on this endless pendulum. Yeah, and I don't have a good way to make sense of that outside of phenomenological descriptions. So it unravels theologically, and it requires experience. Sorry.
I think Žižek would call that ideology because in the Sublime, and this is like his most cited book.
He would
like
say
this is his book.
Ideology.
Ideology, yes, yeah, because narcissism, you could say, like if you are narcissistic, does sort of become its own ideology, not in the sense that it's like a sort of like false conception of yourself or anything like that, but more so that it's like a sort of social reality where its very existence implies this sort of like reliance on it is reliant on reality in a sense. And
it's like reliant on two people sort of lying to each other, and then from that you can kind of build up some sort of system of trust,
some sort of material gain. I mean,
gotcha.
There was literally like a quote from The Sublime Object of Ideology where he pretty much said that verbatim. I could I'll paraphrase it. I'll just like read the quote and I'll just sort of replace ideology with narcissism, because I think this is really, really accurate to what Nick was kind of getting at. So let me put on my best Žižek voice here, and we'll get right into it. So, narcissism is not simply a false consciousness, an illusionary representation of reality. It is rather this reality itself, which is already to be conceived as ideological. So there you go.
Impressive. You nailed it.
Thanks, man. Thanks.
All
glad I could be here for it.
Christian, do you want to say anything else, or before we move on?
No, we can move on. I was going to say something on Nietzsche and Gnosticism, but we can move on to the next one because we kind of passed that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it'll come up again, so you'll have plenty of chances. All right. Oh, I need to share screen again. Share screen. And there. All right. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that not to provoke Christians, but to bring us to the central experience, which I claim is today more precious than ever. I like to focus on these problematic points. Like, for example, another question which I used to embarrass my Catholic friends, which is, I just asked them in all innocence, how exactly do you read? You can imagine me as an old-fashioned communist, how I like that. Those statements from the gospel, I don't bring peace and love, I bring sword and fire. If you don't hate your parents, blah, 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 you are not my follower. How do you read this? Because then I noticed that there is a whole system of de-traumatizing this statement. No, God doesn't, like one Catholic theologian told me, you shouldn't read it too literally. It just means that God, they gave me a kind of a shitty Jedi version from Star Wars. This, the Obi-Wan Kenobi stuff, don't get too attached to earthly objects. Like, you can love your neighbors, but you should love me more, which is for me a ridiculous obscenity, as if God is a jealous guy who said, love your wife, okay, but remember, I'm here, I want to be loved a little bit more. The best answer was given to me by a Polish bishop, who, when I asked him this question, what do those lines mean, told me, it was very funny, told me, my God, I wasn't prepared for this question. Why did you? And I told him, like sorry to use the word again, F 3 points U. You had time 2,000 years to prepare for this question. Like, it's not that I brought something new now, it's in the Bible. But again, I'm not saying this to provoke. I think this brings us to the challenge. And my very simple solution to this challenge is that when in the Bible it said, if you don't hate your father, mother, it's not father, mother as persons, is father, mother stands there for entire power edifice, social hierarchy. That's for me one of the big news of Christianity. An egalitarian community outside of social hierarchy is possible. That's for me the big news. In other, maybe I'm here too pro-Western, but nonetheless, in other so-called pagan religions, in order to achieve this point of, let's call it absolute equality, it's only in death or in nirvana where structures dissolve. But this idea that you can have a collective, and this is for me what Holy Ghost is, an egalitarian collective outside hierarchical structure. This for me, for example, is tremendous,
Right,
tremendous news, and so on.
That's
and so.
him sort of bringing up another anecdotal story that he takes to his Catholic bishops and Christian friends regarding the sort of more violent aspects of the gospel, that is where it does seem like Jesus is being extremely exclusionary, to the point of like you have to hate your brother and your mother and your father in order to love God himself instead, which and he brings up his sort of interesting interpretation of that as sort of this what's necessary in order to have this highly egalitarian sort of realm of like no hierarchy. That's kind of seems like his sort of interpretation of Christianity is this sort of reupheaval of the system of like hierarchical order into a sort of more I guess or into this sort of like flattening of the hierarchies, so that each person can be individually a son of God. I don't know.
Yeah.
Prag, what are your thoughts on that?
I was gonna say he kind of had it going down the right path, where, in some sense, standing against the social hierarchy as it is sort of part of that message. But I think the conclusion was he was jumping ahead a few too many steps, in that it's not necessarily an egalitarian society, because it is rather exclusionary. It might be like saying, being a member of some, billionaires club is kind of like an egalitarian society, in the sense that everybody there is a billionaire. And so they're all equal in that sense. But at the same time, there are those clearly below you outside of that society, and it's very much not equal. So it's not a flattening of everything necessarily. It is, as you kind of said, still being exclusionary. It is still a violent act, which I think is to be taken literally in most senses. I think, you don't have to come at everybody who isn't, your particular sect with a sword, but there is something to the idea that it isn't simply, you have to love God before all these people. It's more along the lines of, for the sake of, your own soul. It's almost like the kind of modern talking point of, cutting toxic people out of your life.
Right.
Except, the toxicity isn't really, what we consider toxic today. It's like,
right.
tossing those possessed by demons out. Something like that.
Right. I do want to push back somewhat, because I think that one of the things that makes Christianity so unique is that for most other religions, you have the in-group and the out-group. And like everything, like all the sort of structure to it, and practices and traditions and things like that are all based within like, how do we maximize the well-being of the in-group? With Christianity, we have this weird sort of inversion, I guess, where not just that you have to love your neighbor as yourself, but you have to love your enemy as well, to the point that you have to go out, bring the gospel, share the good news to the foreigners, and bring them into the fold in a very sort of universalistic sort of fashion, which is like extremely revolutionary, especially to the Judaic understanding of religion, where like the children of Israel are the like God's favored children. Like if you're not a Jew, then like all the practices don't really relate to you. And nowadays we sort of have an elaboration of that, but especially from the very, I don't know, you read the Bible and you do sort of get this highly ethnic, racialized sort of understanding of not of Christianity, but of the Jewish sort of understanding, even to the point that I know the atheists love to bring up the slaying of the Amalekites and all the other sort of racial inequalities between the Jewish slaves and the other slaves that you might see as well. But with Christianity, there's sort of this this more broader outlook that is, I think, quite unique to Christianity, and I'm sure others have sort of taken from it as well, or maybe had some aspect of universalistic components to their religions as well. But I think that's kind of what he's getting at with the sort of the egalitarianism of Christianity.
Did you want to say something first, Christian?
Yeah, sure. That's what I think the Gnosticism of like the Nietzsche, or that is a necessary entailment of Christianity, kind of falls apart, because Christianity is so focused on helping your neighbor in social justice, and I think Gnosticism, especially today, is really harming the church, or just preach them the gospel, don't actually help them, or don't actually do anything that will help them in this life. So that's why I think that's super rampant in the church today, especially the evangelical church, which is nowhere to be found in the Bible or biblical Christianity as Jesus or the Apostle Paul or the New Testament theology.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, especially for the early church. What sort of stood them apart within the Roman culture that they were existing within is the fact that they are, and you could say this is for political reasons if you wanted to take a cynical outlook, that the Christians were going to all the people that were normally being ignored within society, such as the slaves, such as the women, such as the poor and the needy and the downtrodden, and giving them the material needs that they would need and doing what they can to help them. And there's still a large aspect of this within Christian culture as well, with people like Mother Teresa and mission trips and all those things like that, where there's this strong aspect of charity or agape within Christian culture that is to sort of bring, like, spread, I guess you could say spread the wealth if you wanted to go extremely political, but at least like do what you can for those that are in worse places than you are, with the sort of justification or the reasoning behind that like you were once in this same sort of position, and now, and God was the one through other people that brought you out of it. And so you have sort of this duty, I guess, to do the same for even the people that despise you and harmed you. Yeah.
I have something I want to. Sorry.
Sure,
go
go.
on. No.
No,
Okay. Okay. Sorry. So there was something I wanted to add to that, where you were talking about like the spread the wealth thing. I don't necessarily think that in the context of this, you can necessarily construe that as political, because if we're talking about, because again, this is like Žižek's, sort of his own version of this or whatever, where he defines the Holy Ghost as, the egalitarian collective, but it's the egalitarian collective outside of hierarchical structure, which to me kind of places, because Žižek's like, he's thinking about that from like sort of a materialist, you could even maybe say like a more Marxist sort of view of hierarchical structure. And I would say that, when he's talking about the egalitarian collective spirit, he's, I would say, mostly referring to like not just individual relations, but them as insofar as how they bear a relationship to one another. So that spread the wealth, as you were talking about, I don't necessarily think that'd be a political thing. That'd be coming from more so a sort of personal communitarian sort of thing, which I think would more so fall on like a more sort of like apolitical, like churchgoer, like kind of how do you word it? Like when a church like does a charity event or something like that. That's kind of, I think that's more so what
if you have sort of a cynical, maybe leftist perspective, everything is political. And so if you're you're yeah. But yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to make the same point, just that, some people approach the world as if, the classic line, everything is politics. Right. And my inclination is more to approach it as everything is religion. Yes. And I think that's become ever more obvious as politics has become the modern religion. But I largely agree, I think, with the point that Layman was making. And I was going to make a similar point, perhaps phrased slightly differently, which is that when I come across those passages, that my inclination is not towards like what politics is this communicating to me, but rather it's saying that no matter what politics I form out of what I think this story means, it's bound within a certain world that is not the world that is being communicated through this story. So it's not egalitarian in the sense of flattening the hierarchy. It's egalitarian in the sense that no hierarchy you're going to make can communicate the hierarchy he's speaking about to you.
Yes.
Right. So it's egalitarian in the sense that we all have a biased access towards the legitimate hierarchy. It doesn't mean that there isn't a legitimate hierarchy. It means you cannot know it in the way that you can know a political hierarchy.
Yes.
Or the hierarchy of your forebears or history or etc. Right. So it's a splitting apart of knowledge from spirit is how I'm reading it.
Yes.
It's interesting. I'm kind of seeing his like leaning into how atheism is a culmination of Christianity, with this being sort of the backbone of it, that like by Christ telling his followers that like you can't rely upon your father or your mother, or like from his interpretation, the hierarchies of the systems that are currently at play, either through nature or through social structurings. Like even those things you have to turn against because they are not truly God, which is seemingly a radical revolution to the more paganistic understandings, or even you could say the more the Judaic understanding of God as being sort of the highest being that of reality, such that like even the pagan gods work things in towards the good of whatever God commands them to do.
Likewise with deism, which you hinted at.
Right. Yeah.
Right. The clockmaker god.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And he's like showing how within Christianity it is sort of going against that. And this is where like a lot of Gnostics take from Christianity as well, that like being a Christ-like figure is even to reject the God of this world, because this world doesn't work off of the good.
Tillich for you. Tillich has a great, his God beyond the God of theism, which he centralizes, and this is kind of building up out of the existentialists like Kierkegaard, arguably Nietzsche.
Right.
Right. Tillich's more flirting on the edge of postmodernism, but I think it's whatever God you come to understand as God is most certainly not God. Right. So there's this aspect where you have to move constantly beyond. And there is, I would also argue that phenomenologically, there's an aspect of being in relation with God, which is that not only yourself, but God both become a constant discovery unto themselves, right? Your narcissistic reflection of the Imago Dei, it turns you into a question unto yourself. And likewise, God is reflected in that understanding of, ever exploring the mystery, right? You form a conception and immediately the conception breaks apart, bursts under the weight that the conception's trying to hold.
Sort of drawing from the Judaic understanding that like any name that you try to ascribe to God is always going to be sort of an idol. Like that's why they put the apostrophe before the G, in between the G and the D, because like any sort of wording that you might put to it, it can be mistaken as being God.
Right. Trying to account for the error. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So like by rejecting any sort of idealistic images that we might make of God, that's sort of the Jewish framing of it. And you see this even as well within certain Protestant churches as well with their iconoclasm. But yeah, yes. Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was just going to add to that as well. Like this is, classical theism was well established by the time Christianity comes around. And the great project that we normally ascribe to classical theism is not classical theism at all. It's trying to make classical theism work with a figure like Christ. Right, because you're smashing those two things into each other in a way that they just don't mesh. Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of the foundation for a lot of heresies, is just trying to make sense of that. Like, how can we have something that? How can we have fully God and fully man at the same time. And like that just obviously seems like a contradiction. We have to figure out how this exactly works. Like, was there just the human nature and then the divine nature was what impregnated Mary or something like that? And so like, no, that's heresy. We got to cut that
well,
out.
and this is, again, I'll bring it up again, right? The Gödelian error. Like, it's inevitable when we try and overstep with what knowledge is meant to encompass. And I might even borrow from Heidegger there and make a similar critique of metaphysics as an overreaching of the bounds of knowledge. And a mistaking of what knowledge fundamentally is.
That's an interesting sort of distinction to sort of make between what is an ideology and what is a religion, at least within like Peterson's sort of understanding. A religion is based off of that sort of phenomenology and mystery and paradox that you have without trying to encapsulate it into something like easily mimetically transferable between people. Whereas with an ideology, you'll have like a base manifesto. And then from there, you spread that manifesto. Everyone comes on board and everyone fully agrees with it. But the thing is, a manifesto is something too singular in focus. Like the world is not going to work with just a manifesto. You need some sort of like quantum text that has almost contradictions within it, so that the religious leaders can just point to whichever one is necessary for whatever time period. That's like a cynical take you can kind of take on religion.
No, I know. Just to chime in, I think a really good way to maybe sort of like simplify that down would be that an a religion is all encompassing. So a religion is going to be multivariate. It's going to take into account the scope of the world and the scope of experience or what have you. And an ideology sort of looks at that unilaterally. There's one way, there's one very, very rigid, specific way, and we can't account for any other multivariates. It isn't all encompassing. It's just, here's an idea. Everything has to exist under this one narrowly defined idea, and there's nothing else beyond it, I'd say.
Yeah.
Just to add, that was one of like the bits of Peterson that I found like supremely valuable, was his description. And I don't even remember where I came across it, but his description of the difference between a religion and an ideology. And he paints it out so well, right? He's talking about the settlers coming to America. And he basically goes like, all right, you got a positive and a minus for each of these characteristics, right? You've got the colonists, you've got the natives, and you've got nature.
Yes.
Right. And then the one ideology says negative colonists, positive natives, positive nature. So you've got the horrible colonists coming from their dirty cities and,
desacralizing nature and turning it into
nature and ruining these beautiful, perfect natives. And then on the other side, you have the other ideology of positive colonists and like negative. We came and we brought civilization and knowledge and understanding to these, pathetic people,
to these savage peoples.
Right. Yeah. And we tamed the horrible, destructive wilderness that was here before us, with people getting attacked by, whatever,
bears and wolves.
Right.
Yeah. So both of those.
And then a religion is
ideologies.
Doing all of them at once.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, because that's
not doing them at all at once.
You go through and you read the Bible, and the characters in it are very hard to really parse out as sort of these idealistic characters. Like you'll have Adam, not Adam. Well, Abraham,
Adam, David, Abraham.
Yeah,
they're all garbage. Noah, like
they're all sinners.
Are like terrible. Solomon.
It's almost like the way that the story is told is not even to make them look like a good or a bad guy, but it's to make them look like this is real, I guess. It's not so much like telling it from a neutral sort of almost scientific standpoint, but rather like it does have, depending upon which way you look at it, there's going to be the negative aspects or the positive aspects. And you can't look at either one at a single time. It's almost like the duck, is this a duck or a rabbit? You have to look at it and focus at it in a certain way in order to get that picture, or focus in the other way. And I guess like the reason religions last longer than ideologies is because that sort of, I guess, quantum or paradoxical imaging is more in line with reality for some reason, or at least like succeeds better in reality because it has multifaceted use, I guess you could say.
And I've argued in my cult talks, right, the fundamental quality of a cult, the heart of it, the thing that keeps it alive is its ability to process a paradox. Right? That's the most basic quality of what makes it.
And that's probably what drives a lot of people towards a cult, is because there is this sort of huge question.
The skeleton key.
Well, yeah, like there's this huge question that people aren't able to comprehend. And then there's this some unique guru that's actually lays out a way in which to make sense of it. And that's what sort of draws people in, because, oh, this is the guy. Because that's the thing, like you see, especially within the West, like people drawing towards cults because of the problem of pluralism, religious pluralism. Like, oh man, I was raised Christian, but now I've come to realize, oh, Hindus, they have this whole other system of metaphysics and mythology that seems to work for them. And there's a lot of like really spiritually helpful practices that they have. And so like I have two conflicting ideas, but here's this guru that's able to make sense of Taoism and Hinduism and Buddhism and Christianity all into one sort of thing. And then that's what sort of drives a lot of people towards that, because they do see that there is some sort of like truth or something to this. And then from there, you have the cults.
Until you realize that he was just getting by, getting high off laughing gas to make it all work. Yeah.
All right. Do you want to add anything, Prag or Christian?
No, not really. That was good.
All the points I had at one point, you guys kind of you got the conversation was moving so fast that they're kind of behind the time. No problem. They're kind of behind the conversation at this point, but that's fine. We'll watch the next clip, and then I think we'll have a lot to discuss after that.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, this next clip is Žižek's sort of interpretation of the book of Job as sort of a criticism of ideology.
For me, the key was always the book of Job, which I think, if you permit me to say this, it will sound a provocation, but I mean it extremely seriously in an engaged way, is the first great work of critique of ideology. If I were to do, like the best of critique of ideology, forget about Marx, Freud, let's begin with the book of Job. Why? Are you aware what a tremendous thing happens there? We know, okay, let's forget about that stuff. I think it doesn't matter, that comical part at the beginning, how they have a nice evening lunch together, God and devil, and they debate that. But what happened there is that, okay, things go terribly wrong for Job. And then ideology enters. The 3 or 4 theological friends come, remember, and each of them tries to convince Job that there is a deeper meaning to his suffering. The point is not that he's guilty or not. The point is that, the first one says, even if you think you did nothing wrong, God is just, so you must have done something wrong without knowing it. The other guy says, God is just testing you, blah, blah. And I think the greatness of Job is that he doesn't say, I'm innocent. He just insists, no, all these catastrophes that fell on me have no meaning. And then occurs the first miracle. God comes, you remember, and says, every word that you, Job, said is true. He totally dismisses any justification, theological, and then comes the crucial point. Well, I follow my beloved Gilbert Keith Chesterton. Then, nonetheless, Job asks God, okay, but I put it in popular term, but let's cut the crap. Nonetheless, why did all this happen to me? Then, for me, I wonder how you would react to it. I'm here on Chesterton's side. It's the big enigma. That answer by God, where were you when I was creating these, that, monsters, is usually read as an extreme arrogance of God, emphasizing the infinite gap that separates us from God's total perspective. Like, who are you, a tiny piece of shit, even knowing that? Chesterton does something which is for me so shockingly simple but profound. He turns around the perspective, and God's answer is for Chesterton that is the following one. You think you are in trouble, but look at the entire universe that I created. It's all one big mess. Everything goes wrong and so on. That in a refined way, like God expresses his perplexity at his own creation. I think that this is maybe an incredible ethical revolution, because this is already the first step out of this traditional pagan view where justice means you should be at your own place, do your particular duty, and so on and so on. You know, this withdrawal, which then I think culminates in the death of Christ.
All right.
What?
There we go. Yeah, so it's an interesting take from him on the Book of Job there.
The Jungians will have fun here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's my cue. So I thought that was honestly probably very spot on, because from what I got from the Book of Job when I read it was Job sort of believes that he's like the perfect follower. Like, and I would say like in his head, he believes that he's the perfect follower because, you know, his works are there. He's enacting everything that, you know, God wants him to, in Job, again, like in Job's perspective, of course. And I think that, like, you know, when Žižek brought up how each character tries to convince Job, like, no, there's something to this. There's a reason why all of this bad shit is still happening to you. Because, you know, God makes little deals with Satan. Oh, go fuck with Job. Go, you know, whatever. Go bully him, you know. And Job just sort of can't really see like what it is that he's doing, you know, because he insists that like there's this insistence like, oh, all of these catastrophes, Žižek said, like all these catastrophes, it's like they have no meaning to him. And I think that's accurate because, again, like he presupposes he's already enacted good works. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the difference between religion and ideology. I think the reason why all of these, I guess you could say, tests from God, so to speak, were sort of given to Job was because Job wasn't within the religion. He was within an ideology because he had this one sort of narrow purview of what he was doing, and he wasn't taking into account the multivariates. It was sort of a univariate approach to how he was going about his works, if that makes sense. I'll let you guys go on, but that's sort of what I got from that.
What I kind of got was that being a critique of ideology is going up against the friends of Job. Like the friends of Job are the ones sort of presenting these sorts of theodicies and justifications of God on God's behalf to sort of point out how Job is actually in the wrong here. Like, oh, if you're suffering, then that must be due to some sort of secret sin that you might have taken part of, and something like that. And Job is like, no, adamant, like going against that. Like, no, it's just shit happens, man. And it's kind of funny because like Job is like the perfect anti-prosperity gospel that's in the Bible, because like, even if you are sort of somebody that is doing the best you can, obeying all the commands of God, performing all the sacrifices that you need to, life will still be really, really shitty for you. Like you're still going to suffer immensely. and it's not like any amount of like sacrifices or things like that is going to make it any better. And I think from that, there's sort of, I guess you could say, a response to this that needs to happen within, like purely within the religious understanding itself, that leads to Christianity. And that like, okay, given that life sucks, how are we supposed to exist within it and still have meaning, I guess, or like still have some sort of purpose? Because it's obviously not going to be the case that if we do X and X and Y and so on and so on, and so on and so on, that life will just be perfect for us. And so this is like, yeah, Christianity is sort of like the response to Job, in that it's giving us a duty or a way to respond to suffering through radical acceptance, I guess, if you wanted to. I don't know. There's probably multiple ways in which to interpret sort of the Christian crucifixion.
There is.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Prag.
Well, I think, I don't know if it's in this one or another video where Žižek talks about this sort of zooming out of sort of the big picture type of thing. And he talks about how each bit of human experience is sort of like a single dot in like a grander sort of painting, and how in some way I think he gets both maybe Chesterton and sort of the story a little bit wrong, in that I do think there's something to what you said about how, yeah, you can make all the proper sacrifices, you know, do everything sort of by the book, quote unquote, and your life can still be suffering and crappy. I think that's a very Catholic teaching, whereas I think there's a lot of Protestant sects that teach it where, you know, God rewards, you know, the faithful in this earth. And, you know, if you're really good and stuff, you know, God will reward you in this life. But that's not really the Catholic sort of outlook on it. It's like, no, everything can still be shitty here, but that's because this world isn't your reward. The next is your reward. So it doesn't matter how bad things get. And I think that's more what Job is sort of foreshadowing here in this sense. It's not so much that, you know, none of it is utterly meaningless. It's just that you, in your limited state, will never be able to fully comprehend the meaning. And, you know, Zizek goes on to talk about, you know, the tapestry of meaning that is woven by all our different experiences and things like that. And he does call this somewhat of an obscenity, because, you know, I think the example he uses in another one of his lectures, you know, try to tell a Holocaust survivor, you know, that their suffering is just like some piece of work in the greater, you know, human experience and in sort of the greater story of things like that. But at the same time, you know, this is also somewhat necessary if you're trying to avoid Zizek's route of, you know, Christian atheism, and they're essentially being a negative ontology somewhat, which kind of gets on to some other things that Zizek says, but I think I'll just leave it there.
The reason I love the Book of Job is because Job's friends act exactly like modern day apologists when they try to defend the problem of evil. It's like they're literally just trying to give justification for why this is the case. Not like, okay, no, God is the person, he does what he wants. You weren't there, you don't understand. And this happens. But everybody now just seems like, oh no, you did this, or oh, it's justification for this. Oh no, like, no, that's not the point. The point is you're going to suffer in this life. It's going to be tough. But God is there. And I think the point of Christianity, the cross, is that Christ died and suffered with you. He will be there. He doesn't give an answer to why you're suffering. He suffers with you, and he will be there no matter what. So that's part of the reason why I tied the cross into the Book of Job, which I think is truly like the crux of Christianity.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like even within the gospel, there's this story in John where the disciples see the blind man and ask Jesus, like, for whose sins was this man born blind? For his own sins or for his parents? And then Christ sort of rejects that sort of binary understanding of like, the only reason suffering occurs within life is because of some sort of moralistic sins that take place, but rather existence itself has this sort of quality to it that is like you can't escape suffering. I guess you could say very Buddhist in that sense if you wanted to.
Ecclesiastes,
but despite
though,
that, there's still hope. Yeah, so go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was just going to add, Ecclesiastes hits on this point like dead on. Yeah, and one line that kept coming to mind is like, God forbid God use you for his own glory rather than your own. And then I wanted to throw in Jung's answer to Job, where he sets up this dichotomy as the revelation by which, and this is kind of like leading into process theology, before process theology was a thing. But where it is in Job that God is revealed to be lacking, and that it is precisely in that lack that makes the incarnation of Christ a necessity.
Right. Yeah, because isn't like Jung's interpretation of Job that God being prior to incarnation had no understanding of what it meant to suffer as a human being, because like as God, like there's never any sort of deprivation that can take place for him. And so I guess it's sort of surprising for God, at least within sort of the mythology, that Job suffers over the sort of more cosmic game that's sort of going on here. Because that's kind of the interesting thing. Like you listen to people like Michael Heiser and different other sort of interpreters of the Old Testament, and the stories of what human beings are going through is kind of secondary to the more cosmic battles that are going on, and like God's trying to work things together towards good, despite all of these sort of spiritual battles and aggressions and things going on. But it is interesting that, yeah, sort of there with Christianity, there is God condescending and coming down to make right, I guess, the suffering that we human beings must face in life.
Right. And at some point, yeah, I would say Jung really goes at the make right quality, and I would perhaps disagree slightly with Jung. And it's less a matter of quality and more a matter of emphasis, which is to say, I'm not wholly convinced that the incarnation is what justifies Job. So much as it makes it really obvious, right? It reveals it to a very particular audience. But yeah, and then I might follow up with the Ecclesiastes bit, just because, you know, reading through that, it almost reads like a Taoist or a Buddhist, probably more overtly a Buddhist text, right? It starts with nihilism, right, and the revelation that all human pursuits, including the pursuit of wisdom, is fundamentally vain, or right, vanity, useless. And then, right, the whole kind of thing is like, how do you adjust yourself to the fundamental nihilism? And this, I think, is probably really important for where this conversation is headed. In the Christian atheist idea, right? Because it's almost using Christianity to the point of the realization of nihilism, and then adjusting to it through a secular lens. And you know, I would disagree with that as the proper move, and would argue that it's having inverted. I might even go like a Kierkegaardian route here and say that he's fundamentally critiquing Christendom and not Christianity. Zizek with that formulation. But yeah,
that's interesting. All right, yeah, if we want, we can go into that next clip, which goes directly into that. All right, let me see, share screen. And sorry everyone in the chat, I know it's choppy. This is the best I can do. I mean, it's all audio format anyway, so it should be
dies on the cross for me, not a messenger of God. It's not that God is up there, he sends his son, okay, sorry guys, you screwed it up now, maybe in 1,000 years, another Messiah. As Hegel says, what dies on the cross is God of beyond himself. It's precisely God as that transcendent power which somehow secretly pulls the strings. This is, I think, the secret of Christianity, that precisely God no longer can be conceived as, you know, we are in shit, we don't know what's going on, but we can be assured that there is nonetheless an old guy up there who secretly pulls the strings, and so on and so on. This God abdicates. I think that something tremendous happens in Christianity, because remember, after the death of Christ, We don't get back to the Father. What we get is Holy Spirit. Holy Spirit is the egalitarian community bound by love. You know what Christ says when he's asked, how will we recognize if you are here? When there is love between the two of you, I am there. It's just the immanence of an emancipatory collective. This was the deepest insight of even good conservative theologians, like Paul Claudel, definitely not a communist, no, said something very profound. He said the deepest lesson of Christianity is not we can trust God, but God can't do anything without us. God has to trust us. So for me, again, this is a tremendously important message of freedom. Again, as my beloved Chesterton said, it's not, Chesterton said, in all other religions, you have atheists, people who don't believe in God. But Chesterton's reading of those famous Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, Father, why have you forsaken me, is that only in Christianity, and for him this is crucial, God himself becomes for a moment an atheist. And this is so tremendously important for me.
There we go. Yeah. So that's an actually excellent sort of follow up to the previous conversation we were just having there, because he's like, if like from Job, you sort of get this perspective, like life is shit, but at least the reason that it's shit is because there's the higher being, God, that's actually pulling the strings and working things all together for the good.
Yes.
And then with Christianity, that's sort of like responding, going even further than that and saying like, well, no, no longer can you rely upon God being the one that takes care of everything, but you yourself, it's like God's putting a whole lot of trust or like placing bets on us to actually be his workers within the world to try to make it into a renewed kingdom or something like that. And like, you can no longer have it, like you're going to suffer and you don't even know if it's going to all work out at the end. Like, yeah. From there, you can definitely see the small gap to really make that, to say like, oh, atheism. Go ahead.
Well, I thought it was great that he quoted Hegel there, because I remember earlier on I mentioned that sort of like the Hegel's views of God are like a little unorthodox, I guess. And it was really interesting when he said, you know, he gave the quote, "What dies on the cross is God of beyond himself," because it pretty much ties, you know, literally right into what you said, right? No matter what sort of suffering you're facing, there's always that which is out there in infinity that's sort of there with you, and you have this sort of personal relationship with it. And as Žižek said, it is the secret to Christianity. So
yeah, sorry, yeah, Christian just left. I was going to say goodbye to him, but yeah, we should be having a second conversation maybe in like a week, going over Žižek's other lecture, actually titled Christian Atheism. So I'll try to get the same sort of crew that can at least make it in. So we'll go over that as well, which should be interesting. But yeah, thanks for joining us, Christian, if you're listening back over this later. But all right, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, because like within Hegel, God is sort of like the
God is the relationship between
phenomenological being. Okay.
Yeah, God is.
No, go ahead.
I'm pretty sure the exact definition is God is the relationship between the finite and the infinite.
I thought that's like what the individual is like.
I think that's Kierkegaard.
Infinite. Okay.
I think Kierkegaard says Kierkegaard had the same definition for the self and not God, and Hegel flipped that onto God, basically. Same definition,
so like,
different thing.
Right. So like with Hegel, his understanding is like the synthesis that can take place between you have the universal and the particular. And so when you have, I guess, the hylomorphism of those two things, you actually get some sort of action in the world. And when you have action in the world, that's God's like presence or God's movement
Yeah. Like that, like the essence of that, the sort of metaphysical motivation for that is God. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. And so Hegel's understanding is that God as this, I guess, immaterial supreme ruler is what dies on the cross. And the synthesis from that is, I guess, prime egalitarianism, I guess, for all human beings.
Maybe that
now.
goes
like
back to...
Yeah, like maybe all human beings now have this sort of prime divine spark, I guess, within them to be able to have this huge sort of role in the universe. What is the term, the Greek term that's used, like kairos?
I think
that's what he brings up. Yeah, go ahead, Layman.
Sorry. It does go back into what we talked about a couple clips ago when we were talking about the Holy Ghost, and Žižek was talking about the collective egalitarian spirit. You know, it's kind of like you could sort of look at like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit as this, and sort of I think that this can reasonably include that definition of Holy Spirit, where you have the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Ghost, sorry, the egalitarian collective. Then you have the Father, which would be that sort of thing out in infinity, that higher ideal that's providing you with this sort of principled order and structure. And then you have the Son, which is sort of, you know, like the self, like the mediation of these things. Or if I was to describe it in like the Jungian way, right? It's that unification of consciousness, which would be the Father, and then the unconsciousness, which would be the Holy Spirit, I guess. The collective spirit and that collective engagement would be sort of that action, that movement into infinity that Hegel would probably sort of consider the Father to be.
Right. And maybe just to sort of disrelation us from the Gnostics. Yeah. The Gnostics would probably say that like every human being has this sort of prime unique divine spark within them, that they have like some secret access to God and can, like, they are similarly incarnations of God or of the prime good or something like that. Whereas from within Christianity, the understanding is that like, no, there was one incarnation of God. But when we enter into the church and participate in, say, the sacraments of the church, that is when we can be part of that body of Christ in the sort of in the Holy Spirit sort of realm. It's not so much that like each individual human being has this their own sort of godhood to them or something like that, but rather in, I guess, as Žižek was sort of saying, that in this sort of communitarian, egalitarian coming together, that's where the Holy Spirit is, rather than probably the more individualism of Gnosticism that you kind of see.
Yes.
Well, and there's the line when two or more of you are collected, or that's where the Holy Spirit will be. Although I don't know if I would make the differentiation you made at that level, which is to say, it seems like where the split of Gnosticism comes in is in the Son, right? There is no Son in Gnosticism. There's a Holy Spirit and there's a Father, right? And the Holy Spirit carries you ever closer to the Father. And the fundamental goal is to be purely united with the Father. But this does not translate back into action in the world as such. And it seems like that's where the juncture point is not, right? Again, because it's not like Christianity is not Gnostic. It has a very deep Gnostic element to it. What the weird thing is that Gnosticism doesn't rely on demonizing creation or the world as a byproduct of purity code seeking, right? So in a deep sense, Christianity is far less Gnostic than Judaism in a very real way. But right, there's something about that whole translation that's very peculiar, I think. particularly when we realize that all of our actions in the world, no matter how deeply we may find ourselves in communion, will be flawed, and yet those flaws likewise reveal the glory of God. Right? There's again that paradoxical smashing of symbols into each other, where you're able to kind of have your cake and eat it too. Granted in a way where none of it is yours.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, Prague, especially on I guess the last part that he's sort of brought up, that the Chesterton's reading of Eli Eli lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me, is that God himself in his incarnation and like within from his perspective had, I guess, doubts, which is quite amazing. I guess really proving the humanness of Jesus. That
yeah, I'm glad you brought me back in with that line, because I was going to say some of the stuff before was going over my head a little bit. So I'm glad you brought me back in with this one. But no, I think in some sense that's a correct reading. In other sense, it's a bit of a surface reading, because specifically, I believe that quote is the beginning of a verse of, I think it's Isaiah. I didn't look it up.
Psalms, actually.
Psalms, yes, okay. And if you go on to read the whole psalm, it ends up with something along the lines of, God rescuing the man who has cried out to him. And it is something to the effect of like, it's something to the effect of almost like the footprints in the sand little prayer, where it's like, even like, when you thought.
Sort of more triumphant, I guess, to the people that might understand the context of that quote. It, and the ending of it is more triumphant, that like just having that sort of little snippet of it, it's easy to sort of get this despair.
And certainly the people who were watching him being crucified, at least perhaps some of the hierarchy within the Sanhedrin and within the other Jewish authorities, would have known that quote and would have gotten what he's doing as well. And but also at the same time, there is an element of Christ portraying not only his own doubt, but like the fate of those who would come after him. And again, it does speak to what Zizek is saying, which I do think is a correct interpretation, which is it is up to us now. Like, there is no more intervening. I mentioned this before. I was getting a little ahead of it, but there is no more intervening. There is no more overbearing father. It's kind of like, in some sense, God has kicked us to the curb, where we are left to fend for ourselves, morally speaking. And we no longer have him to kind of, well, you kind of screwed up, so here's a flood, and no more bad. You get another go at it. We don't have any more goes. This is it.
Yeah, you can kind of, I guess, draw a connection, I guess, to the prodigal son. Having left the sort of security of his father's household, is left to kind of live the ways of the world, because now he has that sort of freedom just to experience what it's like. And then by doing so, he realizes, oh no, I lived much better when I was under the reign of my father. And so like, and there's, I guess, yeah, go ahead.
No, well, there's a Hegelian side to that too. Zizek doesn't get into it in this lecture, but nothing is the same, after the fall, in the same way nothing is the same after the crucifixion.
Right.
Because the fall necessitates the crucifixion, in the same way that it's not a return to Eden, but now it is the giving of the gates, giving us the ability to access Eden once more, even though it's not as it was. It's with a more full understanding. And to almost answer Zizek's question from the beginning of this lecture, why did Christ, need to die? It's not so much that, the spectacle was for us to be appreciative of it. It was so that it was sufficient for us to understand, not just be grateful, that's one thing, but to understand that what is being given to us isn't just that, we are freed, but that it is the freeing of ourselves from that original sin. It is the freeing ourselves from the failures of Adam, and thereby, even though we do not return to Eden, we have it in our grasp once more. And so, we can choose to be ungrateful with that if we want. We have that option, but now it is at the very least open it up, because Christ has borne the brunt of that cost for us.
Right. Yeah, you can kind of see that, like, that the previous sort of understanding within Judaism is sort of lost, because, like, as we saw from Job, like, just the mere fact that you obey God's commands does not mean that you're going to live a peaceful and happy life. You're going to still face suffering. And so, like, we're born into sin, and then through Christ can that actually be relieved. Whereas previous to that, there was no actual response to that other than perform your sacrifices, do what you need to do, even though life is going to suck for you.
Yes, this is sort of like we said, Job kind of prefigured the crucifixion. This is sort of more, this is the better answer to Job, where it's not just, life might be crappy. Well, it's like, life might be crappy, but but there is something to the end of it. There is a point, Job and, those of the Old Testament wouldn't have seen it, but now there is some hope and salvation. And, if you believe, I don't know exactly what, like, the Catholic dogma of is, like, there's something I've heard of, though, called, like, the bosom of Abraham, I believe it is, where many of the prophets and some of other Old Testament figures would go, and it was like a waiting period until the crucifixion, at which point their original sin could be forgiven, and they too could join, all the other souls who receive Christ's grace in heaven, because, it's not necessarily their fault that they were damned with original sin, something like that. But I'm not sure of the theology behind all of that. It's just something I've heard before.
Right. Layman, did you have anything to add?
Oh, I couldn't find the unmute button. No, I do not.
I might have a bit here. I had something and then I forgot it, but I have something else. So maybe the other thing will come back up. But what comes to mind, and I might be jumping ahead slightly here, but saying that this is Christ's moment of atheism does not ring. You do not call out to God for him having forsaken you because you do not any longer believe in God. Right. It distinctly feels like anatheism.
Well, it depends on what you mean by believe, see? Because if you mean believe as in, like, have faith or trust in, it does seem like Jesus loses that sort of faith or trust, but doesn't lose, like, the ontological belief in God, but rather, like,
I disagree even with that, because why are you asking? You're assuming that there is an explanation for your forsaken status, or there's something happening that you're not aware of. That's why you call out.
Well, so with the sort of, like, terms of forsaken, that screams to me as, like, okay, there was some sort of, like, bargain or deal that was going to occur, and then the other person failed to follow through with that bargain or deal. And, like, I don't know how much you want to assume on to Jesus's foreknowledge, given his human nature and his divine nature. It could be the case that Jesus thought that once he went through his moment of suffering, God was going to send down angels and actually bring about the revolution to Jerusalem.
One gets the sense that that's what was the imagining of how the scenario would go down.
Certainly, at least the case for the disciples, I would say. Like, whether or not you want to ascribe that sort of prediction to Jesus himself, probably, I don't know. It depends on how...
Nonetheless, I'm not saying that there's not a moment of betrayal here, because to me that seems relatively clear, although the aspect of Psalms is really interesting. I like that a lot, and I need to think on that more. But it does not strike me as atheistic. And I've brought this up in previous conversations. Man, I forget the context. An atheistic response, I think, would go very differently, right? And there's something very distinct in Christ's willingness to die for the right, there's some type of ultimate validation in Christ's message that occurs on the cross, whereas one might assume any type of lesser teacher would betray his own teaching and reveal himself to be a fraud in the process, right? And but it flips multiple times, right? Because it is also interesting because Christ is revealing himself to be a fraud in that claim, right? But there's something so honest about the willingness to throw away his entire ministry, right? One would assume if you're already at the point of dying, that at some level you might just carry through with the lie to make the story more powerful, to make it.
Would you, or would you want to sort of get rid of any sort of conscious doubts before passing on to the other side?
To whom?
Yeah, I guess if you don't have anyone there to sort of relieve your guilt.
Right. That's why it's also an expression of the ultimate faith, right? That's what makes it so confusing. Is like, yes, atheism is justified in that statement. Yes, theism is perfectly justified within that statement, right? Again, you're getting the full paradox encapsulated in a single thing. My point, though, is that like a huckster of any stripe, I think, would die as a martyr and claim martyrdom in the process. Right? And Christ does not claim his own martyrdom in the process. And it gives the narrative, the story, a type of weight that just would not exist without that line. Right? There's that moment of expressing the betrayal as your, second to last words. In a very real sense, one could take it as him saying, yeah, everything I told you guys, everything I devoted my life to, this whole thing, it's all bullshit, right? Because I've been forsaken. I've been betrayed, right? So everything else I said must not have been the thing. Now, of course, it's recovered. And I think this is where you get out of the atheistic movement into the anatheistic movement of Christianity that I think Zizek cuts it off short.
Yeah, see, that's the whole big difference between the atheistic understanding of Christianity that you might find in people like Nietzsche or Žižek, where the culmination of Christianity is the cross, whereas most like Orthodox understandings of Christianity, the culmination is the empty tomb.
Right, it's the resurrection.
Yeah,
not
exactly.
The cross. The cross is just enabling the resurrection.
Right. I mean, it's still understandable because like the cross is the iconic symbol of Christianity,
right?
Because it's the kind of inversion of the hierarchy to reality where like the lowest of the low is actually the King of Kings.
It's the perfect place to narcissistically project. We're looking at our own narcissism by making the cross the peak of the symbol. Right. And likewise, right, why isn't great grandma, who is a very nice person, why isn't she still walking around? Right? Well, it's because the cross is the peak, not the resurrection.
Yeah.
Right, in a deep sense.
Yeah, and it's easy to sort of fall into that, especially like when you stare too long into the abyss, to get that abyss staring back into you, when you like see all of the suffering in the world, to get that same sort of Eli Eli lama sabachthani feeling of like, okay, God had this pact, I guess, with the early Christians that he was going to bring about a renewed kingdom. And yet we live in a reality that is just as horrid in some senses as we started with.
Right. But again, likewise, I see like the answer to ultimate despair, and it's repeating from Job, right? Again, at a very fundamental level, if you can encounter ultimate despair and still cry out towards God, that's the whole thing.
Right.
It's and again, Ecclesiastes comes to mind. Again, wisdom starts with the realization of nihilism.
Right.
And that all of your efforts are in vain. And the ultimate aspect of realizing vanity is despair, right? Nothing you can do within your own labor will deliver you from it. That's vanity at its most basic level. So again, what I'm getting in this thing is like this: what in us makes us reach towards a thing we have lost all faith in at the moment where we have the least faith?
Yeah.
Right. There's something
That's
really
the thing you get,
interesting there, right?
even for atheists, that like they're facing some sort of like huge struggle or burden, like,
Right.
and
God
like,
in the
they call out
foxhole.
to God, even though I don't believe in you, can you
Right.
please help me in this circumstances?
Right. And that's in some really real way the ultimate expression of faith, not the weakest. And the way we normally think of it is that's the weakest, because you're only crying out to God because you're in pain. Whereas
Right.
the person that cries out to God when they're in pleasure is more real or whatever. Right.
Yeah.
And it's kind of flipping that on its head. And I don't know. Yeah, there's something really poetically beautiful about that motion. I don't know. Yeah. It captures my imagination very deeply.
Yeah, indeed. All right. We can move on to the next clip. Let's see. Yes.
I think far from this fashionable idea that the Christian era, all that Aquarius bullshit is over and we are entering a new era. Yes, we are, but I don't like this new era. It's neo-paganism and so on. I claim that today precisely we should stick to this tremendous explosive impact. We are still not ready to confront it of what Christianity is truly telling us, which is why I like to say paradoxically that to be an atheist, but don't be afraid, not in the Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens sense, but this authentic atheism in the sense of experiencing the radical absence of any transcendent guarantee. And in this sense, for me, Stalinist communists or some Darwinists are not atheists, they always have some higher figure of necessity and so on. You have to go through Christianity. My formula is not just that I try to give some atheist reading of Christianity, how God is really man, that's bullshit, but that only through the Christian experience can you reach the abyss of what I call atheism for me, which is something, again, much more radical than all the bullshit of Richard Dawkins and so on.
Okay.
That was a perfect place to end it.
Thank you. Yeah, that to me, I think is the most like significant portion of that whole lecture is like authentic atheism has to go through Christianity. And it's funnily enough, it seems like he's making a further case besides that as well, that like almost authentic Christianity has to go through atheism as well. Like in order to be a true Christian as Christ was, you'd have to have those same sort of lack of faith, I guess, in the larger structure of that's out there. I don't know. Your
that ties right into his it ties right into his Hegelianism, that view, because like atheism would be the thesis, Christianity the antithesis, and vice versa, depending on how you're looking at that, I guess. So yeah. Also the authentic atheism part, yeah, because if you talk to someone who's an atheist, like I think whether it's just like a traditional sort of atheistic person or if it's an anti-theist or what have you, they're all going to tell you that like they don't believe in like this transcendent sort of higher power ideal sort of thing. And I think that that's a pretty good way to conceptualize atheism outside of, you're not a real atheist because you don't kill people and focus on specific rigid little ethics like that. I think that really like all encompasses atheism. And I think that's a really good way to look at it, I guess. And he made a really good point too about how people who say that they're atheists, but they're not really atheists because they have this transcendent ideal sort of thing replacing what the function of God would be, which is to provide you with that ideal. Like, here is this place out there in infinity of perfection, and this is what I'm working towards, sort of thing. And I'm going to suffer along the way, but it's going to help me get there. And I think, you know, when he's talking about like communism and stuff like that, I don't think Stalinism is a little extreme, but I think you could definitely apply that to Marxism just in general easily, because Marxism still, even though it is like a material analysis, it still is very, very idealized. You still have to buy into, again, it's like this metaphysical foundation, this grand ideal. Here is the perfect place, a society where there's no money, no class, yada, yada, yada. And they have this sort of, you could say it's God to them would be the dialectic materialism, right, or historic materialism. I always mix up the two, but just the notion that the way that one ought to be, and the way that one ought to be is to continuously strive towards that end ideal of a moneyless, stateless, classless society. What hierarchies are making this happen? Get rid of them. What hierarchies are helping us in this? Retain those. Yada yada yada.
I was just thinking how much like you can kind of see that, and he's like right on that. Like even the highly atheistic sort of ideologies still have this aspect of like they're part of this culmination of like class struggle and dialectic materialism.
Yes,
almost this inevitableness to the utopia that will be brought about through communism or whatever else sort of like revolution that needs to take place. And there is still this sort of like strange faith in history. Like you'll see people wanting to, I want to be on the right side of history, as if history plays under this sort of moralistic domain.
Yeah, as if there's this good and evil
divine puppeteer
this binary
that is like
this divine puppeteer
pushing the weight down a little bit for the good guys and taking the weights up a little bit against the bad guys.
Just also want to cling on to your bringing in of Hegel there, because that was like a big moment in my head there. But the following directly from the master-slave dialectic, right? It's upon the removal of the master that the slave has the self-actualizing or self-realizing experience.
Yes.
Right, the encompassing identity.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, I don't know. I thought that was really interesting to pull into his Žižek's view of Christian atheism there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting the sense of emotion of God, right? And then I'm immediately my mind goes to like Tillich and stuff like that. Some of the later theologians, if you can call them as such.
Yeah. So Tillich, is he the one that wrote the book Anatheism?
No.
Oh,
I forget who came up with anatheism. I don't think he's particularly well known, and the way he uses the term I'm like actually not fond of, but I think there's a really
so what is the term anatheism?
He was talking specifically about the type of theism that happens after a period of atheism.
Okay.
And he was giving it a very different quality than the theism that happens when you're raised within it.
Is this sort of like Reform Judaism or something like that, or liberal Judaism, that like, okay, we were theists and then the Holocaust happened and now like we've lost sort of our faith in God as actually being somebody here to help us, but we still have a connection to our cultural identity, and so we're still returning to theism in a sort of atheistic sense? Or is it, I don't know, he's doing something different?
It's as far as I understand, it is a legitimate return to theism. So people go from a relatively long period of atheism.
Mm-hmm.
They then come back upon belief for some reason or another. But the type of religious person they make seems to be of a very different quality than the dogmatic, theist that we might have as an character in our minds. But of course, there's many examples that make no sense. For example,
what is your interest?
St. Paul.
What is your interest then in the term of anatheism?
Because because I
And
tie
like, how
it,
do you understand it? Sorry.
right. Well, I tie it to the Christian mythos itself, right? So, and again, I'm bringing in Tillich here. So the God beyond the God of theism, right? And I've tried to explain this using like a bunch of different routes to different groups of people. Kind of my fundamental that I seem to go back to most often is like the shunyadic experience. So shunyata, no self of Buddhism.
Okay.
Right, emptiness precedes contact with the Godhead.
Proceeds or precedes, like comes before?
Precedes.
Okay.
Before, right? So that's your atheistic motion, right? And arguably narcissistic, arguably solipsistic, right? It's a self-investigation. It's a stripping away until you get down to the ground of being, which is the emptiness, the divine nothingness, right? And then upon being in the state of divine nothingness or whatever that is, the emptying of self, you see this also in like Orthodox Christianity, theosis or
theosis.
Well, right, the emptying of the self to allow God into the self.
That's interesting. I hadn't seen that connection. Like my understanding of theosis is the becoming part of God, or there's a way in which to say that doesn't sound heretical or anything like that. But
but the way in which it becomes not heretical is that you have to strip all of you away.
Okay.
Right. So it's a negative process. It's in some sense a purity process, but it has deep ties to. And you can tie in a bunch of weird shit here, like right, Buddhism's answer, the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama's answer to "Is there a God or not?" says, his response is, "I have found no reason to believe so." Right? That's a really, and this is a guy that does not mince words, right? He doesn't say no. Why doesn't he say no? Why does he frame it? "I found no reason to believe so."
Well,
right?
So it seems
Buddhism,
like he's making
a comment on belief.
Yeah, because isn't within Buddhism metaphysics sort of like getting in the way of the practices that help you on the Eightfold Path? So like,
because it's trying to bring you to the shunyadic experience, and if you go with this idea that the only way to access novel contact with the Godhead is through the shunyadic experience, which has strains within Hinduism, Christianity, and Buddhism, or arguably Buddhism, then you can see why creating a Godhead figure would only distract you from being able to access the shunyadic experience and would keep you bound within Tillich's God of classical theism. You never get beyond the God, beyond God, right? Or you never get to the God beyond God.
Like what within. I read Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, and I keep on I like see this Hebraic sort of prophet going up against the Israelites and their idols that they make, and that's like the title of Twilight of the Idols. He sees the Christian conception of God as sort of this idol that is just promoting anti-life ideologies within people, or an anti-life religion within Christianity. And I don't know. Is it? I don't know where
there's a bunch of weird.
I don't know if.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know. I was just thinking, like, even within Nietzsche, there is still sort of a reliance upon the Übermensch as sort of God, and that's kind of like I see Nietzsche as sort of like a return to Hebraism, like the Hebraism of the Old Testament, and like that God is the sort of working through history, I guess, if you want. But within Christianity, that sort of hope is I don't know, within history you don't have that hope, but only through the cross do you have that hope, which is a very personal journey that each Christian has to go through, carrying that same cross.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. I probably went with a more surface level reading of Nietzsche. towards a type of neo-paganism, a revival of gods that embrace life and making do with the principalities rather than looking for that which is beyond the principalities, which has very deeply the potential to err towards the Gnostic rejection of life, right? In the Platonic sense, even, or even Neoplatonic, I would argue that's where a lot of Gnosticism starts, or at least becomes obvious. Which is it's again that kind of making contact with the pure realm and then trying to enter the pure realm. Oh, that was a thought that came up earlier, and I forget the context. But it was like, if God wanted to communicate with philosophy, we would be living in a world of thoughts. But God made a world of matter. So there's some level of communication that makes an event like the cross necessary, right? Otherwise, we could just think our way to it. But yeah.
Yeah,
sorry,
that's interesting. Like we would just be like characters on a probably a Platonic dialogue.
Right.
We would just we like if God was a philosopher, we'd all be like characters in the Pantheon or not the Pantheon, the Parthenon. Yeah.
Nobody would be vibing. They would be the vibe.
Right.
I think Pragmatic wants to hop in.
Oh no, I was just gonna say it's a very good point that I think obviously we are of matter, and so there is something to be said about the communications through which we go, and that I think has something to relate to how perhaps classical theism was, rather than how it had to gel with Christ's appearance on the scene, more so was fulfilled by it, in the sense that obviously for a long time we've known that we are matter and that the desires of the flesh are not that of God, but at the same time God still made us flesh. So would he just put us here to suffer or something like that? Is he a cruel God?
It's a big joke.
Yeah, as a big joke, something along those lines. But no, it is in Christ revealed that the suffering isn't for naught. Again, it is fulfilled through the crucifixion and through the resurrection itself. Is that it's a kind of a purification process in some sense, but also it is to give greater depth and understanding of what lies beyond the flesh and things of that nature. And so you can't fully appreciate that world of Platonic forms without understanding like its lower, baser kind of natures. And it's almost sort of like a working through of the system. Like, you start at the bottom of the totem pole and you kind of work your way to the top kind of thing.
Right. And I guess you could probably work in some sort of Christian theodicy as well. Like, it seems like that it's kind of like within the biblical story as well. Like, what is it? Genesis 50:20, where Joseph says to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God worked out towards the good, or worked for the greater good. And I think in like Romans 8 somewhere as well, that's sort of the classical Christian theodicy, is that it's better to start off in this sort of like minuscule state of evil and suffering, and then come out of that through into a glorified body, I guess you could say, which is sort of the Christian hope. I don't know, maybe I'm elaborating a little bit too much there, but what are your thoughts, Pragmatic, on Zizek's sort of Christian atheism, or alternatively atheistic Christianity? Because it's not like this lecture is just going up against the atheists, although it is. Like, he's going up against Dawkins and Hitchens regularly in this. He's also bringing forward this, like, his understanding of what Christianity really is, based upon that, like, most Christians haven't really gotten at this point.
Well, there's certainly something to be said that a lot of true Christians do go through moments of great doubt and not knowing what their mission is. I think a great example is actually Mother Teresa, who in her personal writings, which a lot of people didn't want revealed, it revealed that she had immense doubts about what she was doing, about how she hadn't really felt like she had spoken to God, or God hadn't spoken to her in a very long time, and she had no clue if what she was doing are right or not, and how I'm not sure how much it got into whether or not she regretted doing it, or if, you know, she felt like this was a mistake. But, you know, she was clearly someone who did have these moments of doubts. I would
Right.
say these things can lead to a more authentic belief and a much deeper belief, but they are not necessary to do so. Because, you know, and I would almost try to. Yeah, no, I won't. I'm not going to try to do anything. I just say it can be necessary, but for some, but it doesn't have to be necessary. It's a personal thing at the end of the day, at least in some matter of belief. I think the larger idea of atheism having to go through Christianity is, of course, not just correct in the Western sense, but there is something about all modern ideology essentially being a reaction to Christendom, which came to dominate Europe. And I forget who said it, but there was a great quote that I heard not too long ago that there is nothing truly like the church except to be completely outside it. And it was made by someone in reference specifically to Eastern faiths. In particular, I believe it was Buddhism, and how Buddhism draws a lot of similar conclusions, not entirely the same ones, but a lot of similar conclusions that the faith does, and has sort of, you know, it's not a, you know, rigorous scholastic kind of understanding of the universe, but still, even without that methodology, arrives at this understanding that, you know, the teachings, you know, I'm trying to make it bigger and more philosophical than it is, but it's, you can kind of see people who have seen these things before understand where some of the overlap is, as there is with all faiths, but in particular Buddhism, just because it's something truly and utterly outside of any Western scope or belief system, and as such, the fact that it arrives to similar conclusions without having basically any exposure to this stuff is something to be, you know, looked at with perhaps a bit more of a watchful eye.
I was just thinking from a couple of different things. Like, you're bringing up Mother Teresa also reminded me of the story Silence of the Jesuit priests who went missionarying into Japan. There's a movie based on it from Martin Scorsese with Andrew Garfield and Liam Neeson. That's
Very
quite
good.
impactful, really. It's excellent. And just to sort of people working within their faith, despite seeing all this like failures on their part, to like they're trying to bring what they believe to be good into the Japanese nation, and seeing how it's just getting everyone killed and tortured and turning their backs on the faith as well, is puts you into a state of complete despair. And for that priest, like, and similar to Mother Teresa, as I understand, even through prayers, there was getting back no response from God of any sort. And maybe there's some aspect of like virtue within faith despite divine hiddenness that can occur. And I don't know, it's made me think of like a classical argument against God is the fact of divine hiddenness. But given Christ as sort of this ultimate symbol of Christianity, I wonder if we should instead expect this sort of divine hiddenness that Jesus sort of had, and where he had these sorts of expectations for what was to be the case. And from his perspective, where he was, God reneged on his deal. And why have you forsaken me? I don't know. It's just quite a few things kind of popped up there and just sort of laid it out there. I don't know. Something to think more on for sure.
Well, and there's the question of like, why are the conversion stories so powerful? Why are they so shared, right? Much more so than a pastor or whatever that's just been raised within the faith and followed it his whole life, right? And there is something very deep, I think, about what you're hitting on there of like, what does it mean, right? What does belief mean in spite of the divine hiddenness? I think that's a really key.
Kierkegaard's book Fear and Trembling is like full on like trying to understand the faith of Abraham. Why is Abraham the father of faith, or the knight of faith, or I think it's the greatest
resignation
of faith or something. Yeah, and he, I don't know. It seems like by having these sorts of doubts and still working through them, it's exhibiting some greater amount of faith, which from the Christian perspective is a virtue. But it seems like from every other perspective, even from the perspective of yourself, can appear to be as a vice, especially for Abraham, whose story is so paradoxical to the way of understanding it from any sort of normal human lens, or even a religious lens. It's almost like one of those stories that you don't want to read too much into. Right. Otherwise it can like it can justify child killings from people with schizophrenia or something like that.
Right.
And it's like, how much as Christians, how much do we want to actually praise Abraham and his acts of faith due to the problems that it could arise for the people that are not as mentally stable? And,
right.
And I guess the question can be raised as well, like, how mentally stable was Abraham, in fact?
Well, and the counterpoint within the religion too is you have Noah and Moses, who are delivered the miracle up front, right? So the counterpoint to Abraham, who's just given visions, or and then he has to go act on it and hope that it's correct, right? And then it pays out as he continues doubling down and doubling down and doubling down. Theirs is the opposite in some sense, which is like they double down on the receiving of the vision and it works, and then they fail,
and then they still doubt God.
Right. Yeah, right. Noah being drunk and naked with his family around him, right? And Moses striking the stone instead of speaking to it, and then wandering the desert for 40 years after bringing 9 troubles onto Egypt and splitting the sea. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, after all of the plagues of Egypt, they get to the Dead Sea, and then like, God, what's going on? You left us here to die or something like that? And then and then God pulls through, of course.
Right. Yeah. And then it's right, and there's a great lesson there again, and tying back to the theosis as emptying of self. Moses has this moment of hubris of I've got to perform all these miracles for these suckers all the time, all right, let's hit the stone and get some water, and he's taking it onto himself instead of releasing the self, and that literally is the switch, right? And like there's the accounts, the shining of Moses's face, right? He keeps it hidden because they don't, and that's great too, the ambiguity around the accounts. Like his face was so shining he had to keep it hidden, and then there's like, well, no, he was hiding it because the shine had disappeared and he was just another dude again, like, oh, it goes either way.
Oh, that's interesting.
But all of this is like getting back to that difference between religion and ideology. Right. Yeah. It does not let us form an ideology. If we only had the story of Abraham, we'd have an ideology. If we only had the story of Noah or Moses, we'd have an ideology. Right. But it's the combination of the two. Like in some sense, you're failing no matter if you're winning or not. That takes us into this, realm where we can seemingly explore forever.
And I think that's a common mistake that a lot of atheists make when they criticize sort of like religious ethics, I guess. They kind of look at one individual story and they assume that story is how a religious person ought to act. And that if a religious person reads that story, they're going to act within the narrow purview of that story. And that's all there is to it.
Right.
Right. It's almost like reading the Bible as if it were Ayn Rand propaganda or something like that.
Yeah. Back to the objectivists.
Yeah. All right. Okay, we'll move on. Let's see.
How many more clips do we have, John?
Let's see. 4. I don't know. We can stop at any time if we'd like.
Okay.
I see it's already 10 o'clock. You guys want to call this last one?
Yeah,
and
sure.
then we can, okay, that sounds good. And we'll move on if we want to. I don't know. The rest are somewhat
we're approaching like 3 hours.
Comparable. So. Oh man. Okay, yeah. This will be our last one.
My problem with them
He's referring to the atheists. Yeah.
is that, of course, in some stupid sense, it's true what they are saying. We are probably the result of evolution and so on and so on. But it simply absolutely doesn't work, as there is absolutely no insight for me in Dawkins and so on of how a religion effectively works. It's a whole dimension is missing that they're even, I claim, mostly totally wrong about the status of belief. Belief is for me something very mysterious. Like, do we really believe? How do we believe? As to believe, it's not true. We believe more than ever. We just invented something absolutely breathtaking. That beliefs, in order to function, to operate, don't have to be first-person beliefs. You can literally believe through others. You know the formula of parents, like, we are atheists, but not to disappoint our children, we pretend to believe, the Santa Claus story. You ask a parent, do you believe in Santa Claus? Yet, are you stupid? Of course not. I buy the presents, but I pretend it for my children. Then you ask the children, do you believe? They said, no, we pretend it not to disappoint our parents, and together, like, what's my point here? You have a belief which is nobody's belief. No one believes in the first person, but it fully functions as a social belief. Here, and now I will stop, I will not go the full Fidel Castro way of talking for 7 hours. Here, you did a mega contribution. By you, I mean United States, especially you here, Hollywood. Your greatest contribution to 20th century world culture, I would claim, is, sorry, my old joke, canned laughter, Are you aware what a strange phenomenon this is? You return in the evening home. You open up a stupid show like Friends Cheers, and you are too tired to laugh. You just look. And the TV set laughs for you. It works, at least with me. Afterwards, I feel relieved as if I was laughing. So much about primitive people. We claim, because we have traditional examples of this, like, the Buddhist prayer wheels. You write a prayer, you put it there, you turn around the wheel, and you can think about pornography, whatever. In reality, you are praying. We are the same. This is canned laughter. And I claim that beliefs function in a strictly homologous way. What we need is not a belief in first person. We need to believe that there is someone who believes, even if that someone is purely hypothetical. So for me, the truly Christian gesture, now I'm approaching the end, is precisely to abandon this objectified belief. Like, let me give you, now I conclude, an example of what I mean. And I hope you will agree that it would make the movie much better. Probably we all know Roberto Benigni's film, I don't like it, La vita è bella, life is beautiful. You know the story. Father, son are taken to Auschwitz. Father, in order to save the trauma, the son, to protect him for the trauma, tells him a bullshit story, that this is not really prison, it's just a big competition site where we can leave whenever we want, but if you remain to the end, there will be a big prize, and so on and so on. You know what would have been a way, I wonder if you agree, to make it a much desperate film, that the father were to discover at the very end, when he's to be shot, that the son knew this all the time. Just he pretended to believe his father to protect him. This would be the proper Christian reversal, as it were. And the movie, again, this is why I don't like it. It's not strong enough.
Man, he's got such a way with words. I had to like cut out a whole section where he went off on like the hedonism of modernity, like how people aren't really hedonists. It's good, but it just took he'll like interrupt himself and then interrupt his interruption.
Yeah.
And then go on from there. It's hard to like pin down, but yeah,
Really layers on the interruptions.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's I think from this you're sort of getting an idea of like what is Zizek's sort of, I guess, prescription, if you wanted to say that. I don't know if Zizek would even go so far as prescribing anything, but just I guess his sort of forlornness that reality isn't this way. That if we lived in a truly authentic Christian / atheist culture, people would believe, it's not ironically, it's people would believe, I guess, on a sort of facile way. I guess
In service
maybe
to
like,
each other instead of in service to themselves.
Yeah. He
Yeah.
seemed to take a very communitarian bend to that, because he was sort of, when he was talking about life is beautiful. Have you guys seen that movie? Because I have.
I haven't.
I have not.
I watched the trailer of it, but yeah, it sounded pretty impactful, I guess.
Yeah, so basically the movie is about a son and a father, and during World War II, they're imprisoned in a Auschwitz. I don't know if it's Auschwitz specifically, but a Jewish prison camp in Nazi Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And basically something that the father and the son are in the same camp together, and he basically convinces his son that it's sort of like a dramedy, like it's kind of a comedy as well as, obviously having very heavy subject matter. And basically he convinces the son that everything that he's doing, all the activities that the guards tell them to do, all the slave labor, yada yada yada, it's all just part of a big game. And once they finally reach the point where they're out of the prison camp, everything is fine and well or whatever. And that point is basically when like the war ends and the Nazis lose and stuff like that, and the American soldiers come in, and he pretty much, spoiler alert, but Žižek already spoiled it, so it doesn't really matter. He gets killed at the end, and the son never really comes to realize that it was all just a game. And obviously, for the movie's sake, that was done to evoke a certain emotion out of the audience. You see the father die, it's sad. But I think it would have been really great if the son, so like what Žižek said, I agree with him completely. It would be better if the son discovered at the end that like he knew that he was playing that game all along, and rather than having this, what Žižek just called an objectified belief, where it sort of just becomes this, oh, we know that this is fake because, we presuppose materialism or whatever. Oh, it was just a little game, yada, 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 that the son actually realizes how profound that belief in the game was. What underlied that belief was sort of this real tangible thing that helped him strive through those circumstances without like just wanting to die all the time. Like I thought that was awesome.
Yeah, I think this gives me a much better understanding of like what his idea of Christian atheism is, where you have the belief, and the belief works in that it produces this like stress. It provides, I guess, the relief from the weariness of reality.
Yeah.
Even if you don't have to actually believe in it. Like he has the anecdote later in the lecture of Niels Bohr and the horseshoe over the doorway to keep out evil spirits. And like, aren't you a scientist? Do you actually believe in all this? Like, oh no, see, the guy I bought it from, he told me that it works even if you don't believe in it. And so it's kind of this ironic, I guess, belief structure that's out there that, I don't know, it's interesting, I guess, that he's sort of proposing this. And in a lot of ways, he's right, because like the belief does have this positive secular social utility to it that like you get from people like Adam Friended or Jonathan Haidt and David Sloan Wilson, people like that are actually promoting religion in a weird sort of way, despite being like hard materialist secularists, just due to the positive benefits it has, sort of like a placebo effect.
Yeah, they view it as like a necessary delusion sort of thing.
Right.
To them.
Yeah.
I don't view it that way, but that's how they view it.
Right. Marx's quote, religion is the opioid of the masses. And so like, if reality is so horrible that it requires opioids just in order to exist within, then by all means, drink up or take it down the hatch, whatever it takes, really.
Although I would have to, just to clarify though, like Marx, he viewed like the opiate, he didn't view it as like a good thing, the opiate. He viewed the opiate of the masses that religion was as sort of this thing that like the ruling class sort of, this delusion that the ruling class would like impose on the workers to make them like subserve to the elites or whatever.
Right.
It wasn't sort of this,
sort of like a parasitic
it wasn't like,
process that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It wasn't this like, it makes me feel like when you hear opiate of the opium of the people or whatever, it sounds like he's saying on the surface that, it's like a drug. It makes me like feel good or whatever, despite whatever chemicals it's inducing, not existing while I'm sober or whatever. And that it's just a delusion. But what it actually is, if you read the full quote, is it's the ruling class. Religion is just a tool that the ruling class uses to fuck over the workers or whatever, keep them subservient.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I was gonna say.
No, go ahead, Craig.
No, just quick. It very much. I don't know if you guys have ever read the book "Man's Search for Meaning" by Viktor Frankl. He was for those who haven't, he was a Holocaust survivor who went on to sort of using some of the teachings of Nietzsche and Freud, create a type of therapy called logotherapy. And one of the things he talks about, which is kind of relating to this sort of Christian atheism and its belief structure that Zizek puts forth, is that he quotes Nietzsche in saying, "He who has a why can survive anyhow," and that's very much the case in how Zizek is supposing that this belief system might work, in that our why is those around us and society at large, you could say as well, if you really want to put it in the abstract. And so even though that actual belief isn't there, the why for faking it till you make it, you might say, is there. And so that's why it's all propped up. I might have my personal disagreements on how effective that would be in the long run and as an overall societal model, but I can certainly understand it. But also, point of personal privilege, I did believe in Santa, so like I don't know how the kids in Europe are, but I actually believed in Santa and was very sad to find out he did not exist. So just pointing that out.
My mind went the same place. So I can see something like what Žižek is posing there as a temporary kind of band-aid solution that has almost zero, a very limited half-life. Yeah. And I think he's massively undercutting what belief is, where you can't take away either of those effects. So I think he's correct in saying that is a major component of belief, but without the ontological reality, the ability to legitimately digest it into the self, and have it produce novel phenomena, it's not gonna do the thing. And it's mitigating those two worlds that I think is what's so powerful about a belief system.
Probably one of the most significant reasons for atheism is just due to the lack of actual belief in generally the parents. So like you have kids, and then and you might attend church like once every Christmas and Easter or something like that. And the kids, they see like, okay, why are we going to church if there's no truth here at all? Like,
right.
Yeah.
Am I really supposed to buy that God flooded the entire world and just brought every single animal onto a single ark, two of each kind? Like, come on, do you really expect me to believe that? And then,
again,
yeah,
right? Christendom. It's like, if it's only that type of belief, you've lost it. Like, there's nothing there. Right?
Yeah, it's shallow. Yeah, and they realize that because kids aren't stupid.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think you're Prag and Nick, you're right on that. Like, this sort of facile pseudo-Christianity isn't really strong enough to actually build a future off of. it's interesting because like he has a
very
point about the
Girardian.
canned laughter.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. It's operating off Girard, right? It's triangular desire, right? The person's laugh on the television is satisfying, or is the expression of your desire to laugh, but it's like this belief through the desire of the other to believe, right? It's that type of cycle. And ironically, right, Girard's whole point is that Christianity itself makes triangular desire impossible. So
unless you're
there's
practicing
probably
that.
something interesting there.
Unless you're practicing in that shallow way, of course.
Right.
Yeah. Because like I think that's where Zizek's Marxism kind of came out a lot in a good way. Because I've kind of discussed some things that I find kind of bad about Marx so far, but to give Marx like a lot of credit, like I really I find his theory of it sort of ties into this idea of commodity fetishism, where the idea is that the way that sort of these mass-produced sort of media, I don't know how to just these stories that you see maybe in like a really shallow sitcom. He was talking about Friends and Cheers, and I hate those shows.
That was your instance where you could have like zoomed in on your picture.
That is. Yeah, I know. I forgot that I could do that. Yeah. Oh, that's
do
really
it in.
unfortunate.
Second.
Yeah.
Do it again.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah.
Layman, how do you feel about Friends and Cheers?
Oh, damn it. How did I do it?
All right.
No, wait. I figured it out. Okay. Go. Wait, let's reframe that again. Go for it.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the TV shows Friends and Cheers?
Well, the shows Friends and Cheers, I think, are pretty fucking awful, pretty fucking terrible, and they need to just. Yeah. Okay.
That was worth it. That was
good.
No, that was good.
Okay, but going back to what I was saying. So yeah. He was sort of going to the idea of like commodity fetishism. So it's the idea that like when a product is there, which is what those shows are, they're products. They're being sold to people. Oh, here's all these friends having these quirky little interactions with each other. Isn't that so relatable? Ha ha ha. You know, having the audience laugh for you because no, this is how you're supposed to respond to this. And you know, the average celeb is just sitting there like they're not laughing. They're sitting there just staring at the screen, but in their head, they're like, yeah, this is a funny show. So it's kind of like that, right?
Yeah.
Where a commodity, the idea is that like a commodity is sort of speaking to like it's sort of positing itself as like I know Marx would not agree with this language, but it's sort of positing itself as like a false idol to you and sort of.
Well, that's the thing. Without having some sort of like purposeful meaning or end towards what you're trying to achieve, all there really is consumerism. And so whatever the best products I can consume, that's the best life that you can have. And
yeah,
like,
it's one of the things that
probably
I
all
like.
of us here are yeah.
I was
just
sure.
gonna say,
Everybody's
all
like,
of us here, despite maybe even having more traditionalist attitudes, seem to like we're sympathetic towards Marx because Marx is actually I guess drawing upon this more idealized version of what a person is rather than just a cog in the consumerist machine. Like,
yeah,
I'm sure all of us see that like living the materialistic lifestyle that capitalism provides, of just working from 9 to 5, and then you go home, have a nice wife and kids, and sit down, watch TV, and go right back at it. This is like a horrible life to have to live within.
yes.
And yet that's the way things are. And so like Marx really is able to, I think there's probably a strong reactionary response that can be had towards Marx rather than just sort of the left wing, because that's a weird thing. Like,
for sure, because I mean that's what I mean on the right wing side of things. That's the whole reason why fascist regimes occur in the first place. It's a response to that alienated condition. That's what all of these sort of failed experiments to sort of get past capitalism are kind of rooted in. It's like you have these societies that, you know, you start this populist uprising, you know, oh, here we're making your alienation radically, we're going to radically invoke it within you, and then we're going to make you angry, and then we're going to make you passionate. And then what it does is it creates this power vacuum because the masses are kind of irrational, and all these authoritarian guys kind of swoop in and they're like, oh, hell yeah, like we can absolutely take advantage of this for our own benefit and mold a society into whatever the hell we want to mold it in. And yeah, that's how all of this happens. But that's why you know, that's my favorite thing. That is the thing that I like about Karl Marx a lot, is that theory. And it's something, I just think it's a really important piece of political theory that a lot of people, even people who are, you know, might be a little more apolitical, who just want to sort of address problems within society. Like if you're a psychologist, you know, the theory of alienation is probably very helpful as it's relative to certain people's circumstances and things like that too, you know, like, which is a more apolitical thing, but people are alienated for various different reasons.
It's so interesting too. I just looked it up, and right, Kierkegaard and Marx are born 5 years apart from each other. So it seems like there was some type of train, right? I'm sure this has to do with like the dating of the printing press and the availability of literature and mass-produced goods following, you know, in the early to mid 1800s. But it's interesting because it seems like they attack it from both angles, right? Marx is coming in from the heavily materialistic side and seeing how the goods themselves and the replication of product change the framing. And then likewise, you have kind of the Kierkegaard and the existentialists on the other side, looking at the phenomenological aspect and looking at how memes themselves degrade under certain social influences, right? It's I've called it cultural entropy before. But right, you kind of see this, I don't know, later, right, you get, ironically from Dawkins, you get the idea of memes. And then, you know, we never really mapped out how ideologies or mimetic forms, what their life is, right? They're the development stage and how they process and how they degrade and what that means for our self-conception and stuff like that. So, I don't know. That's where my head went with it.
Yeah, no, that makes it. Yeah, because you can't really see the meme, you know. It's something you observe through other people's. I know, it's a great sentence. You can only see it through people's actions, right. And you're sort of forced in a sort of weird kind of way where you have to, like, if you want to find some truth to any of it, you have to psychoanalyze people, and it's like, who the hell is qualified to do that outside of like you have to be a psychotherapist to do that, even to make somewhat of an inference, you know. But you can't like deductively prove a meme.
Right. But that's also what's so interesting is where we're at with it now. So when the cost of production goes to zero, then you get viral mimetic spread. And now we can kind of say like, oh, I can justify the truth of this meme on the number of times it was shared, or how many nodes did it touch to the point where it incited a response in return. It's not unlike, like, you know, looking at a single cell organism, hitting it with electrons or whatever, photons, and seeing when it, you know, responds to the stimulus. So yeah, yes. I don't know. We're in a weird spot with it because we are getting such immediate feedback, and all of these entropic cycles within our mimetic frameworks have been like sped up to such a high degree,
to like light speed,
right?
To the point that like the whole cultural morality from fucking 5 years ago is
totally
completely out the window. It's like if you like proclaim some of the culturally normative ideas from 5 years ago, that's, oh my gosh, you're an out. Wow, you're quite the radical. Or it's like,
well, yeah, because that goes back. This kind of goes back to Jonathan Haidt when he released that book, The Coddling of the American Mind, where he ties all of these sort of radical cultural shifts back to social media and how that's affecting people's psychology. And like, it kind of goes back to what you said earlier, Nick, about the printing press, because, you know, that was a time when, oh, well, now we have all of this unparalleled access to information relative to that time. And I guess maybe in a way that's sort of repeating itself now within this past decade or so. And that's why we're seeing like, oh, like the cultural fabric is like totally different now and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Damn. I can't milk that too much. I got to get out of this window.
Yeah. All right. We should be wrapping up. Prag, do you want to add anything to that? Or bring up some other points?
No, that was solid. I was just going to say maybe if you really wanted to read some sort of not new Marxist, or I guess you could call them neo-Marxist authors who could be read in a very reactionary light, I would definitely, you could definitely go for some, go for the Frankfurt School people, go for, Horkheimer, Adorno, Gramsci, things like that.
And if you want, maybe even a non-populist right-wing notion of sort of like prescriptions of like the theory of alienation, I'd really recommend everyone read specifically the 2002 edition, though it came out in the 80s, of The Meaning of Conservatism by Roger Scruton. He talks about the theory of alienation in I think probably about 3 chapters of that book. He talks about alienation, and in one specific chapter, he even like talked about Marx as well, and like, oh, here's where Marxism overlaps with traditional conservatism, and here's where it doesn't. That was really interesting because it really sort of, I didn't look at Karl Marx the same way after I read that book. It was a really good book.
Yeah.
So I'd recommend that.
I'm sorry, I had to cut out for a second, but I was going to say, if you want something by them, definitely The Culture Industry, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, and Selected Essays on Critical Theory by Horkheimer. Just some reading by, and there you can read them in that more reactionary light, but also it's a kind of know thy enemy sort of sense to the reading as well, I suppose.
Gotcha. Yeah. I wanted to actually show some appreciation, Prag, for your bringing up of logotherapy and Viktor Frankl, because that was a really remarkable connection to draw to Žižek's sort of belief in belief, or how did he say it, secondhand belief or something like that, which is really fascinating. Because like when I read the Man's Search for Meaning, if I wanted to put on my cynical glasses, I could say that, oh, he's figured out the formula for coming up with beliefs that relieve you from stress, or not even stress, but like psychological trauma or different things like that. Like he has this story of a man whose wife had died and he was like considering suicide. And then Viktor Frankl like talked to him and like, okay, here, just think about this. Like, would you have rather if you were the one that had died and your wife was now here talking to me considering suicide? It's like, well, no, I wouldn't want her to have to live with that type of suffering. Well, like, okay, well, in that sense, you're living in the better possible world because you're the one that has the strength to actually live with your wife's loss. Whereas if your wife was here and you weren't, she would be the one having to face that. And that was something that like he brought up to really encourage the guy to be able to get through this. And I guess I had sort of introduced that with a bit of cynicism, but I think there is like, I don't know, I appreciate Viktor Frankl's outlook because does have this sort of like stoic practice that is viable and useful in actually being able to deal with the struggles of life. And I don't necessarily think that it's just lying to yourself. It's actually thinking about it in such a way, like you could even tie it to cognitive behavioral therapy. We get sucked into these false notions that end up causing us to suffer. And sometimes even just saying true things can help us get out of it. I don't know. I didn't really have any point, I guess, to that, but I do really appreciate that connection that you drew there, because that makes me much better understand Žižek's sort of understanding of secondhand belief as sort of the logotherapy to the people, I guess. I thought you weren't gonna milk it anymore, Layman.
I don't know why it's doing that.
Sure.
I'm
All
gonna
right.
leave it at that.
All right. This was great, man. I'm really looking forward. Yeah. So I'd like for everybody here, as well as Christian, to be able to join us for next week. If not, I don't know. The scheduling might have to change. I also wanted to get Trygve on as well, because he's actually a
Atheist?
yeah, I guess atheist, but in a sort of Peterson way.
Okay.
So
He's not an anti-theist.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And he sees, like, in his own words, he sees religion as sort of a language for existence, and like it's sort of a necessary language just in order to exist. I don't know if he'd go that strong, but at least that's how he sort of considers what religion and religious symbology to be. So yeah,
Symbolism.
next week, let's hope. I think we're gonna go over Christian atheism, the 2017 lecture from Žižek, which I think is actually probably a better lecture than this one, because he actually lays out sort of his understanding. This was much more free-floating, conversational, and then building up and interrupting himself and then interrupting his interruptions. But
Yes,
yeah,
he does.
Thanks everybody for joining me. Thank you, Nick and Pragmatic Culture and Layman and Christian. Thank you for the audience that has joined us. And yeah, good night, everybody.
Good night.
There we go.
Nice.
That was so cool, man.